The next set of ratios is in a different category. It looks at debt. It looks at how much does the company rely on debt for its financing. The first is at the overall level once again, and that is the debt to total assets ratio. And in this particular case, as the name implies, it's total debt divided by total assets. If we take a look at this, we'll find it strictly from the balance sheet. And for MicroDrive, that ratio is 41.7% compared to industry of 25%. So this is pretty significantly different, where MicroDrive needs 41 cents for every dollar of assets to be financed by debt providers, whereas for the industry, they only need 1/4 of the amount of assets to be financed by debt. So there's more liabilities, which means less equity proportionately, which means more risk. So that's why we are concerned when we see high leverage ratios, and this is one class of leverage ratios. It means that the company has more debt, and that might put it in jeopardy in that they may not be able to pay off their lenders. The next one is a similar idea, except it's debt to equity. Simple computation once again, total debt divided by total equity. And this just shows the relative ratio of equity versus debt. Again, for MicroDrive, it's at 1.01, which means it's equivalent. Anytime you see a ratio that's 1, it means they're equal, right? You know that from your algebra. So a ratio of 1 means that for every dollar of equity, we have $1 of debt. And that, again, in comparison with the industry, is worse, right? So there's more leverage for MicroDrive at 1.0 compared to the industry at 0.46. So for the industry, it means that for every dollar of equity, there's only 50 cents of debt. The final one is market debt ratio, and this is just looking at market values rather than book values, so it's a slightly more precise measure. The computation starts, the numerator is the same, total debt. However, the bottom is the total debt plus the market value of equity. So it just looks at the total amount of financing that came from outsiders to the company, how much of that came from debt. And MicroDrive would be at 52.3%, industries at 20%, so guess what? Once again, MicroDrive has more leverage than the industry. So all these put together would lead you as an analyst to be a little bit concerned and investigate how safe the company is in terms of its leverage ratio. The next set of ratios take a slightly different angle at the debt management. So the first is liabilities to assets. Again, similar in many ways, except here we're comparing total liabilities to total assets, and includes not only the debt, but also current liabilities, vendor liabilities, etc. So it's a more sweeping view of liabilities, not just debt providers. Here, we're at 55% for MicroDrive versus 45%. So surprise, surprise, once again, MicroDrive has more debt and therefore would appear to be riskier. The next one is very useful and used a lot in industry, and it's because it looks at the crossover between the income statement and the balance sheet. So it's called times interest earned, sometimes simply abbreviated TIE, and it's Ebit, which again is earnings before interest and taxes divided by interest expense. Now the interpretation of this one's pretty simple, because let's say it's 1. 1 would mean that the amount of earnings that the company makes before it has to pay off its interest and taxes is exactly equal to the interest. In other words, they make no money after you pay your interest, right? Because if your earnings before paying interest is $1, and the amount of interest you have is $1, then you've got nothing left over for profits. So we always want to see high numbers in a TIE ratio. We want to be very safely above the amount of interest expense. Now let's look at MicroDrive. 4.2 versus 10.0. So it's not that MicroDrive is unable to pay its interest, it's able to pay it 4 times over. So it's pretty safe in absolute terms. However, the industry is at 10, which again is much safer. They could be way off in their profits and still be able to pay off their interest, whereas there's not as much safety buffer in the case of MicroDrive. The next is EBITDA coverage ratio. This is a refinement on the one we just did, the TIE ratio, because look at the numerator. It's EBITDA plus lease payments divided by interest plus principal and lease payments. So this one looks at a broader view of fixed charges to not only be interest, but interest and lease payments. And it looks at EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And that, for finance people, is a kind of a shortcut to get at how much cash flow is generated from running the business. The number, when we go through the information, is 4.3 for microdrive versus 12 for the industry overall. So, yet once again, we've got another indication that microdrive cuts things a little more closely and therefore may be a concern in terms of its ability to pay its bills, particularly to its landlords and to its lenders.